That is to say, psychology broadly is, well, let me ask you, what ways would you begin to define what psychology is? What are we talking about when we say psychology? Yes, ma'am.
The study of the mind.
The study of the mind, very good. So what is the mind? What's the mind?
Just like the human brain and how it works.
Okay, the human brain and how it works, very good. Is this okay with everyone? That psychology is the study of the mind, and that the mind is the human brain and how it works. Yes, sir?
I was going to say the psyche, hence psychology.
Okay, what do you mean? What's psyche? What's that word mean?
You know why I've always compared it to mind.
Okay,
Mind can go in the brain. So I was just kind of copying it, I guess.
very good. So what's the difference here? I guess here's my real question. What's the difference here between the mind and the brain? We start to say that psychology is the study of the mind. Do we mean something different than psychology is the study of the brain?
Like behavior, the mind's behavior,
The mind's behavior, what do you mean?
as in not looking at it physically, but what it does.
I love that, right? And so I often think about, and you'll hear me make these analogies in class from time to time, I often think about the brain as the hardware. I'm sort of a nerd, I like computers, and so I think of the brain as the hardware, right? It's the piece of equipment. And your mind is the thing it's doing. It's the processes, it's the software if you want, right? It's what the mind, what the brain is capable of producing. The mind, if you like, is really sort of an emergent property. That is to say, it doesn't exist anywhere. It is the process that something else is doing, right? It comes out of the brain. We can't see it, but it is the process of the brain. So when we talk about psychology as being the study of the mind, what we're really talking about is psychology being the study of what the brain is doing. I will add on that we should also include that psychology is the study of the mind, but also behavior. We would also include that, right? That is something else the brain is doing, but we probably wouldn't call it the mind, right? That's kind of something else. But psychology includes that as well. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I was just going to say the mind, I guess, could be something that we develop over time. Kind of like, we have our own egos, and so those kind of formulate off of experiences that we've had in our life.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And the mind isn't going to be this stagnant thing, I think you're saying, right? It's something that's maybe going to change over time with us as we age. Very good. So I'm spending all this time saying how psychology is not the study of the brain, but I do in fact want to start with the brain. So we're not gonna, you've seen the syllabus, we're not gonna start looking at brain structure so much right now, but I really wanna look at the brain broadly. I wanna look at the brain in terms of 3 broad sections that are gonna help us get to know the mind as it is. I haven't drawn this in a while here. Brain. Okay, that makes sense, brain? It's facing that way. Before we come into this, let me say this first. One thing we should know about the brain is that the brain evolved, of course, the brain evolved from the inside out. So the oldest parts of our brain, of the human brain, the oldest parts of our brain in terms of what we can see in prehistoric records, what we can see in early evolutions, are going to be most central to the brain. We'll call this area 1 for now. And then, of course, right, it's evolving outward. You get this second section, call that area 2. The brain's really lopsided. And then we've got this most outer section. I'm going to draw this a little more precisely. Okay, still makes sense. 1, 2, 3. All right, so we're gonna come back to this. Who can tell me, I'm gonna ask you all, but who can tell me what are the order in which vertebrates, okay, animals with backbones, what are the order in which those animals evolved? What's the earliest vertebrate?
Quite one.
In particular, you're right on. You got it. What's mostly aquatic life is made up of?
Fish.
There you go. So the first vertebrate evolution is fish. I'll leave you a number. And what? What makes sense after fish? Birds? That makes sense after fish.
Reptiles.
Okay, on the way. Right from fish to reptiles, there's this great creature that's like amphibious, because it can do both.
Frog?
What's that?
Frog?
What species?
Amphibian?
Talking about amphibians. Good. I said species, I probably meant order or something. So we go from fish to amphibian. Oh God, I'm a bad speller, so good luck. Google that, look that up. Sure, that's right. So from fish to amphibian, and then, here we go. The other side of amphibian is a reptile. Okay, then bird. It's missing. It's left.
Mammals?
Mammals. Where do I put mammals? What's that? After reptile, but reptiles go to birds. Don't let me scare you off, you're right. After reptiles. Turns out reptiles evolved in two directions. They evolved both into mammals and into birds, right? You've all seen that sort of weird looking dinosaur with the wings. It's kind of half a bird, half a lizard. We don't see this as much, but basically kind of the four-legged structure of a reptile eventually evolved into a mouse-like thing, a rodent, you can say. Right, that same tail, 4 legs, low to the ground, right, eventually evolved into a mouse and then out from there. So, reptiles kind of split into birds and into mammals. This is important because we can begin to see the evolutionary track of the brain by thinking about what these creatures were capable of psychologically, or are capable of, I should say, psychologically. So, in this first part of the brain, we're really going to get fish stuff, we're really going to get reptile stuff, and amphibious, not amphibious, but amphibian stuff. So what would be your guess in terms of what this part of the brain is doing? What would you think this first part of the brain is doing?
Basic life functions.
Basic life functions? What's that mean?
Eating, defecating,
Okay, eating, pooping, breathing, good.
circulation, stuff like that.
Circulation, say again?
Motion,
Motion, what type of motion maybe?
walking, swimming.
Okay, getting around, right, just kind of getting around. Anything else, this first piece? Why do you think that's there? What made you think that?
Basic things you have to do to survive,
And why would that be in the first area?
or else they wouldn't have got to the second area.
Very good, right? I mean, this is a lesson, you skipped right through it, but I think it's important, right? If you're gonna build a brain, well, it's gonna take care of the very first things first, right? The first thing that fish can do is not write poetry. right? The first thing they can do is move and eat, right? Circulatory system, probably some things like reflexes, noticing danger, right? These type of basic survival things. And so this is what we're gonna see in this first part of the brain. And again, we can begin to think about those aspects of psychology, right? So one level of our psychology is one in which we just want to stay alive. This includes things like fight or flight, our reflexes, and some things like that, okay? So this first level, we actually call this the hindbrain. The hindbrain. Now, again, I want you to understand that these are just sections of the brain. When we get to talking about the brain, there's nothing called the hindbrain. It's really just this innermost area, okay, that includes several structures, but is not a structure in itself. It's like saying your torso, right? That's not a body part in particular, it's just a broader area. So what do you think about this second level, which we really see light up in birds? Of course, you know, the more advanced species have it, but we really see this first kind of light up in birds. What can birds do that reptiles can't do? What's that? I can't, who's talking? I can't see whose mouth's moving. Yes, thank you. Say it one more time. What did she say?
She said they can fly.
They can fly. Clever. Whoa. Some fish can fly, some reptiles can fly, especially back in the day. But yeah, okay, they can fly. What else? Psychologically, what can they do?
They can communicate
They can communicate? What do you mean?
audibly.
What do you mean?
They're-
You ever heard
they're
a lizard
sharp
squawk? At least they show that on Jurassic Park. I'm joking, go ahead.
They, I don't know, they tweet and everything,
Okay,
back and forth.
so they seem to have some,
More complex relationships and communication.
right, they seem to be able to maybe signal to each other, whether that's a mating call or a danger call or a hey, feed me mom call, right? There's some level of communication that you don't really see with reptiles, right? You don't really see reptiles kind of squawking back and forth at each other. You see them maybe being aggressive, but that's not, I guess it's a type of communication, but it's not a cooperative communication. It's get the hell out of here. No, you get the hell out of here, right? Just kind of back and forth. Whereas a bird may be saying, hey, snake, don't go down there. So one thing that we're gonna see in this second level, which we call, by the way, the midbrain. I do want you to know that when we get to the brain structures, you will see something called the midbrain. This is just a problem with the naming of these things. There is actually something called the midbrain. Ironically, it is in the hindbrain, so don't get confused. Again, we're just talking about this now as a broad section of the brain, not a particular structure. So there is a structure called the midbrain. Please don't let that confuse you. If you Google it, you might get that structure. So one of the things that's going on in the midbrain is communication. What else? What else can birds do, or have you seen them do that you don't see reptiles do? Yep.
Could it be argued that there's more self-awareness,
What do you mean?
more awareness of the surroundings, I guess? Because you were talking about how they may be able to warn, like, I guess others in their pack or their group that there's like a snake nearby.
Okay.
So.
And so you're saying they just have a better sense of what's going on?
Sense of their surroundings, yeah.
Sure.
more advanced.
Okay, we can't quite know that, but I would say that in general, you might expect that just they have more processing power, so maybe they're kind of more able to kind of take things in,
Sure.
pay attention to those things. What else in specific though? Yeah,
Like build nests.
Okay. you're a clue. We do see some reptiles build nests, but they do different things with those nests. What's that?
Raise their, kids, I guess.
he said raise their kids. What do reptiles do with their kids? He said they get rid of them. What does that mean?
Some of them eat them.
Some of them eat them, okay? But what, I guess maybe I should ask, what don't they do with their kids? That birds do.
They don't feed them.
They don't feed them, okay? Not only do they not feed them,
They don't raise them.
they don't take care of them, right? Reptiles lay eggs and leave them there, right? Alligators, one of the more advanced reptiles, they watch their eggs, right? They'll build a nest, lay their eggs, they'll guard that nest, but once the eggs hatch, they're out, right? Birds, however, form a relationship with their young. And this is what I'm really looking for. That in this second section, what's really going on is our capability to form relationships with one another, or at least others of our species. So not only do you see birds care for their young, what you also see birds do is bond with other birds in terms of flocks, but also just in terms of partnerships, right? Sometimes birds will mate for life. And so this second part of the brain really seems to be where we, if we're just going to think about human psychology, first began to relate to each other, to learn to work together, right? And this turned out to be beneficial. So this midbrain is really communication on a basic level. We'll talk a little bit about that. But more broadly, it's about relating. It's about relationships, okay? Empathy, some of that stuff. Number 3 is called the forebrain. What's left? What's that?
Mammals.
Okay, mammals. So what can mammals do that these other animals can't do? Talk. All mammals? All mammals? No. Okay. Some of us. What's the difference between talking and communication? Say again?
What did you say?
What's the difference between talking and communication?
Understanding each other.
Understanding each other, say more?
Communication could be just like, for birds, it could just be tweeting, but they're not like saying anything, they're not speaking, they're just like making a sound, and that's a kind of like,
Yeah? I think you got it. Yes, sir?
I mean, talking tends to involve a vocabulary, or like
It's important about that.
words.
It's important about that.
What's important about it?
Yeah.
I mean, that way we, at least us, we specifically understand what exactly we're talking about. With like signals or that kind of communication with gestures, that's a lot more broad.
Okay. You're almost there. Yes, sir.
I was just gonna say, like, what he was saying, you have to form a language to talk and understand each other, you have to understand language, they're like a lot more broad.
Okay. You're all right on the right track. Last guy.
Like, I was just gonna say, like, talking is just one type of communication. Cause like, talking is our way to communicate, but like, birds and reptiles, they all have a different way to communicate rather than we do.
Very good. I think that's an important thing to distinguish, right? We're not really talking about talking. That is just the sound that we make, right? What we're talking about really here is language. What's the difference between language and communication? You guys are all dancing around it because it's not so much about the hearer. I know a lot of words and I can teach them to my dog. He can't say them, right? But I can teach him a lot of words that I know specifically. So it's not so much about the interpretation of that language, though that obviously is important. I can't tell him to go make me an egg sandwich or whatever, right? He's gonna look at me. But what is important about language is that I can say anything, right? I can take any word that we have and put it with any other word that we have, and I can virtually say anything that I can think of. And in fact, if we don't have a word for something, well, I can just make one up and say, what I mean by you know, that time when it's about to rain and the sky's dark, but there's clouds in the sky. You know, I'm gonna call that vertisuite, I don't know, that's my word for it. And so now when I talk about vertisuite, you know what I mean. Right, so language has this unique capability of being able to put any idea into a communicable form, right? Communication or bird tweets or mating calls, right, don't necessarily have that quality. And so one of the things that we're gonna see in this higher area, especially of course within humans, though we see some, you know, not as good, but we see some semblance of that in other really intelligent creatures like chimpanzees and dolphins. But one of the things that's gonna be in this higher level, this forebrain, is gonna be the ability to make language. That's gonna be a big one. What else can humans do that others can't do? I don't have my phone, I have a watch. What time is it? 11, what's up?
1:26.
All right, we're good. What else can humans do? Yes, sir.
Kind of going off what you were just saying, like you don't have like your phone, but like we have opposable
Thumbs.
thumbs.
Okay, that's not quite
I know, but I mean.
psychological, I don't think, unless we're all imagining them.
It is evolved.
It is evolved, very good. You can also stand up. What else can we do? Yes.
Humans can carry their children instead of like leaving them,
We can carry.
like in their body.
Oh, sure. Oh, yes. So you guys are giving me some really interesting features of being a mammal and being a human in particular. We're in a psychology class, just remember that, right? And you're not wrong, but I want to try to focus down on what psychological things are mammals capable of. Yeah.
People like developing emotions.
Developing emotions, say some more.
That's all I got.
Okay. Well, some of that is going to be in this midbrain area, right? That just kind of empathy, emotion, relating, right? Our understanding of emotions, our ability to say, well, I probably shouldn't have said that to her and it seemed like it really upset her. Maybe next time I'll say it like this, or I'll ask for some advice, or I'll go cool down, right? All of those things, our ability to reflect on our emotions and maybe understand them in some ways rather than just be pissed off, right? Why am I pissed off? That's gonna be something that's gonna be higher brain. Yes, ma'am?
What about like looking in a mirror and like we can recognize that's ourselves, but like other animals don't do that?
Okay, so being able to recognize oneself, identify yourself. Say more?
Sentience, like we're sentient, but
Sure, that's not quite that, but the idea that we can represent ourselves in our head, very much so is gonna be in this higher brain area, right? Sentience, so to speak. Yep,
Like complex thoughts, like you said, like poetry,
Very
being
good.
able to draw meaning from things.
very good. So drawing meaning, understanding on a deeper level that we can think about, okay? There's one important one that I haven't heard yet, yeah.
Animals have like just instincts and reactions, but we have like, we can analyze it, collect facts, and like make judgment and discernment.
Very good. Broadly, what you're describing, I'll just write this word for you, is what we call cognition. Now, we can really say most animals have some version of cognition, but this is something that we do excel at, and cognition just really means thinking. But it doesn't just mean thinking in the sense of the words in your head, it also means thinking in terms of your thought process, right? Your step by step, that you didn't necessarily lay out in words, but you kind of just know to do that. There is a little hint in there in terms of this last piece that I'm looking for. Something we can do that animals can't do, many animals can't do. Yeah?
We have an inner dialogue in our brain.
Okay, so that's still a piece of that cognition, I would say. Yes, sir?
I was gonna say like, I don't know what a lot of people call like muscle memory, but not necessarily, we have the ability to learn new things. Like, I don't know, like for instance, like a new sport or something, we have the ability, like it seems like animals do a lot of the same things over and over again. We have the ability to do complex things, learn.
Sure. I mean, and we're gonna learn that thing faster because we can think about it. But what I'm looking for is plan it. Plan ahead. Use a tool because we see that, you know, my camera's gonna be too low if I just lay it on the floor. And so I should buy a tripod, and somebody thought of that and built one, right? And so our ability to use tools, our ability to plan, this is something that is really unique to humans, but broadly to this section of the brain, right? You do see animals use tools to some degree. You do see animals plan ahead. I mean, building a nest is planning ahead, right? It's gonna get cold later. I should make somewhere to sleep, or the leaves are gonna fall off these trees. I should probably collect those nuts and bury them for later. They're not great at remembering where they are, by the way, but they are sort of planning ahead, right? You do see that, but we're great at this, right? You're here in college 4 years ahead of when you're gonna make any use of what I'm talking about today, if at all, right? Maybe this is just your gen ed and, you know, you just need to get out of the way, and still, you know, you made a plan for that. So this is gonna be one of these huge things that we can do. So this is called, maybe I should have started here. This is called the triune brain model. Okay. So if you search for this, again, the midbrain in particular, these aren't structures again, but you will find it as a structure if you search for it. So if you're looking for a little bit more information on this breakdown, this is called the triune brain model. Okay, so it's just kind of splitting the brain into these 3 parts. Any questions for me about this? All right. So what you should know, of course, is that in addition to just these 3 ways to look at psychology, right? You could have somebody who's studying any one of those 3 aspects of psychology, right? You could have somebody who's studying reflexes. You could have somebody who's studying fight or flight. That can be their whole career. You could have somebody who's studying relationships and nonverbal communication. You could have somebody who's studying, you know, our ability to plan ahead, executive functioning, right? All of these different types of things, or psychology of actual language. And so you can study the brain from all of these different perspectives, and this in some ways, it's not quite a problem, I'm going to call it a problem for the lecture. This in some ways presents a bit of a problem for psychology, because often we don't quite know where to start the conversation. Which piece, if we're trying to study, let's say, addiction behavior, which piece of the mind, what aspect of how we could look at the mind is most important to that conversation? And so we don't, of course, think about studying psychology just in terms of thinking about the sections of the brain, but they do lend themselves to some of these different areas. So I'm just going to write a few on the board. I've already talked about cognition, so we'll talk about cognitive psychology, talk about social psychology, talk about physiological psychology, or if you like, neurology. You might also throw psychiatry right there. We could talk about personality psychology. We could talk about cultural psychology. We could talk about what I'll call psychodynamic psychology. I may add a few as I keep talking, but these are some of the main ones. The point here, and I'll describe what these are, of course, but the point here is really just to think about the fact that psychology can be divvied up in all of these different ways, and in fact, many psychologists, I mean, we all call ourselves psychologists, but many of them really look at what's going on in life, what's going on for individuals from these different angles. So let's talk a little bit about just what cognitive psychology is. Again, cognitive psychology is really interested in the thought process, is really interested in thinking, again, if you will, not just the words in your head, but again, those processes. And so if we're looking at, let's just go back to addiction. If we're looking at addiction from a thought process point of view, how does addiction come about, say? What do you think, and I know you're just being introduced to this, but what do you think a cognitive psychologist might say? Why does a person feel addicted to something from a cognitive perspective? What do you think? Yes, sir.
I guess it could be argued that the natural process for a person that struggles with addiction would be that repetition, that kind of, that hooks them to that one desire in particular.
Okay.
That constant, like, desire to want to continue to do it.
What sort of thoughts do you think are in that person's head in the midst of that process?
Like tempting thoughts, you know,
Okay.
something that makes that very, I guess, very eye-catching, very grabbing.
Okay, some sort of tempting thoughts? Yes, ma'am?
I think that the person will be thinking that they can go without whatever the addiction is.
That's right. How am I gonna get through the day if I don't have a cigarette?
Or they will understand without whatever they're addicted to, that they can do a certain thing.
That's right, and so that's great, right? And so here you can see how the thought process itself, right? The cognition, the thought that the person having really lean into that addiction. I can't get through the day without it. I'm much better when I've had a cigarette. I'm much more friendly. I get really, right? You're just, maybe those things are true, maybe. But you're also telling yourself them to reinforce them. So for instance, if you went to a cognitive psychologist, a cognitive, we'll say clinical psychologist, because you had an addiction to smoking, say, they would really be interested in what are you telling yourself about smoking and how can we change your thoughts, right? I want you to start telling yourself, you know you don't need that cigarette. Yeah, it's tough, but you can get through the day, right? Cognition, cognitive psychology is really going to be interested in that thought process. And when you get into the really nitty gritty stuff, they're not even thinking about the words yet. They're just thinking about how you perceive certain stimuli in your head, right? That's part of that process. No, but what did you see, right? What went off in your head that made it seem that way? Okay, cognitive psychology, one I forgot, I told you I would, is often paired with, these aren't in any order, so don't worry. What I forgot is behavioral psychology, and sometimes you'll see cognitive and behavioral psychologies paired with each other. That is to say, you'll see cognitive behavioral psychology. This is a pretty popular treatment regimen. So behaviorists are not even interested in what's going on in your mind. They take this really extreme stance, not all of them, but if you are a classic behaviorist, you're gonna take this really extreme stance that, listen, I may be a psychologist, but I can't read your mind. I don't know what's gonna go on in your head, and in fact, you might just lie to me if I ask you. And maybe you don't need to lie. Maybe you don't know. Maybe you're lying to yourself. So I'm not gonna deal with any of that. I'm just gonna deal with your behavior. You show up to me and you say you wanna stop smoking. Here's what we're gonna do. Every time you smoke, I want you to burn yourself with that cigarette. Right before you're done. When you're thinking about putting it out, you have to put it out on your arm. This is how we're gonna handle that. What's that gonna do? It's gonna tell you that you're gonna hurt yourself. Yep. What else? Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, I guess it's gonna associate smoking with something that's gonna harm you.
Very good. It's gonna associate for you smoking with harm, right? This little bit of pleasure I'm getting also comes with a bit of pain. Maybe a lot of pain. No psychologist would ever say this, I don't think, by the way. I'm just using a colorful example. But so what's going on here is these are just behaviors. So what this psychologist is going to say again is, I'm not interested in what's going on in your mind. I'm really just interested in your behaviors. And when you do a behavior that you're trying to get rid of or you're trying to deal with, well, I'm just gonna tell you to then do a behavior that you really don't like, such that you put those things together. We're just gonna deal with behaviors. I'm not gonna try to talk you out of it. I'm just gonna punish you, basically, or have you punish yourself when you do the thing that you didn't wanna be doing. And we'll also throw in some rewards, right? If you go the whole day without smoking, you can, you know, I'll give you a 10% reduction in the cost of your session today. Also not something that psychologists would do, but again, for an example, right? I'm gonna do something that you like. I'm gonna give you something nice in order just to get that behavior to change. So again, here we have somebody who's still looking at human psychology, this fact that this person has an addiction, this fact that this person is engaging in behaviors that they don't want to engage in, right? That's still psychology, but I'm gonna handle it by just dealing with your behaviors. This is essentially training. This is essentially how you would train an animal, a dog, right? Because I can't get in my dog's head, right? If I want him to learn to sit, I just give him a treat when he does it right, and maybe punish him when he does it wrong. Right? That's the only direct way of communicating that you do there. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, I have a question about, like, forensic psychology. Is there more like psychology based or is it like more science?
Very good. Forensic psychology is kind of a section of clinical psychology, which is not up here, but it could be. This list is not exhaustive, please. I really am just trying to give you the understanding that psychology comes in a lot of colors. But forensic psychology is really kind of a type of clinical psychology. And what that looks like is I'm gonna do some testing on a person, usually maybe some type of interviews. And what I'm gonna do with that is try to figure out or help the judge or help the jury figure out the outcome of some case. So I had a supervisor when I was in graduate school. She did forensic psychology. It wasn't like criminal investigations, but what she did was parental custody cases. So if some parents were breaking up, one or both of them might come into her, do a battery of tests, and she would give a recommendation of which of the parents was best suited, psychologically at least, to be the parent of the child or have most of the custody, right? And so that might also be something like, this person have the psychological profile to commit those murders that we heard about? Does this person have the capability to stand trial? Is that person fit to stand trial, or do they seem to have some mental deficit that really we should try them as a juvenile, or we should really consider some type of mental health outcome rather than some type of criminal or punitive outcome? Okay, great question. So that's another way, right? You might look at these things. All of the different sections of psychology don't necessarily answer all of the questions. I mean, I can maybe think of one for all of them, but maybe you'd have a harder time thinking of why cultural psychology would make somebody smoke. If you've ever, I think it's a friend of mine lived in China for a few years, and he was talking to me about how just incredible it is about how many people are often or always smoking. So you can still see kind of a cultural piece there. But some of these would be easier to fit. Social psychology, we'll spend a good bit of time on this when we get there, but social psychology is really interested in how a situation or how a social setting, if you want, influences a person's psychology, influences a person's behavior or their thinking or their feelings. So, for instance, if we're looking for a social psychology reason as to why a person might be smoking, what's something that we might come up with?
Home life.
What's that?
Home life.
Home life, what about it?
Like if like say your parents went through a divorce or something and like you just stressed, like you just smoke.
Okay, that's a great one. So your home life is just stressing you out, and this is one mechanism that you know to help de-stress yourself. And so that social situation is making you reach for the cigarette. Great job. Yes, sir.
Who you're friends with?
Okay, what do you mean?
Like your friend group who you hang around, like you tend to do the same things they do.
Okay, so you got a lot of friends that smoke, right? Not you necessarily, but one has a lot of friends that smoke. And I don't know, maybe you don't love it, but sometimes they offer you one and you just take it to go stand outside and keep talking to them, right? Yes, sir.
Could be like a family familiarity, like growing up around it.
Okay, so you kind of just used to growing up around it. Again, maybe it's something that you learned from watching as a way to de-stress or a way to have fun or whatever it is. Good. It could also just be the situation. How many of you know folks or are that person who says, listen, I don't smoke, but I do like to smoke when I'm drinking? I don't know how many times I've heard that. Maybe you're too young, probably not. But, right, I've heard that a lot, right? And that's the situation, right? I don't necessarily smoke all the time, but when I'm downtown at the bar, hanging out, feeling good, I don't know, it feels kind of nice to have a cigarette, right? All of that would just be social. Not necessarily, again, we might still just say, hey, all my other friends are smoking, I don't want to look like the dork who won't take at least one cigarette every now and then. I mean, right, we could make it a cognitive thing, but we could also just point to the social piece and say, well, it's just because you're with these folks and there's a lot of pressure there. Physiological, right, this is easy, we can just point to the addiction. Hey, this nicotine has gotten into your brain and now you have this deficit of nicotine, and so now you're going to want a cigarette because your body's used to having this certain level of nicotine, perhaps dopamine, and so when that goes below a certain threshold, you're going to say, oh no, I need a cigarette, right? So all of these different ways. You just want to be a cool guy, right? Or as we've said, right, it's just kind of culturally appropriate, or maybe even kind of culturally mandated, depending on what the action is. Does this make sense? Okay. Again, the lesson really here, and if you have a book or just looking it up, right, the lesson really here is just to think about all of those different ways in which we can address the mind, in which we can study the mind, in which we can approach certain behaviors, right? We can say it's something more cognitive, or we can say it's something more physiological. And really, none of them were wrong. Why did that person light up outside of the bar, right? We could, if we don't know, if we just see this happen and we're just having a thought experiment, stranger lights up a cigarette out of the bar, okay, class, what are some theories, right? Depending on your approach, you could say any number of things. Okay, you could say any number of things and not necessarily be wrong. And in fact, if we went up and asked him, we might still not know, because he might not know. I don't know, I just felt like a cigarette. Did you notice all of your other friends are smoking? Did that have an influence? Maybe. Is it because your nicotine levels are too, right? We could do all of these things and he may still not know. So one of the reasons, by the way, psychology gets sort of called a soft science is because of this, right? It's because it's trying to think about all of these different possibilities, and in fact, several of them might be true all at the same time. It might be all of them. It might be one we missed. And that's sort of the complexity of psychology. Okay, questions for me? Tom? I'll bring the watch next time. 11:59, okay. So the last thing I want to just kind of talk about is the difference between the applied side of psychology and the more scientific side. So we're mostly in here going to talk about the scientific side of psychology. We're mostly going to think about understanding things from a psychological perspective. In fact, I would say that's probably my main goal, is to get you to just understand how a psychologist thinks, or how a psychologist could think about the various things that are maybe happening to you, in front of you, or that you're reading, learning about in other classes, okay? So just being able to have that perspective, or at least just be aware of it, even if you don't want to use it per se. So one of the things, again, that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time, though, talking about is the applied side of psychology. Now, this is probably, though, the thing that most people think about when they think about psychology. So when I say applied, what I mean is using psychology, not just studying things via psychology, but using it to do some type of work, right? Psychologists, as you probably understand them. So there are several ways in which you can do applied psychology. Probably the most well known is clinical or counseling type of psychology. If you wanted to be a clinical psychologist or you wanted to be some type of counselor, what do you need to do? Where do you get started? Or what qualifications do you need? I guess is my real question. Okay, you need a psychology degree, just a bachelor's degree? Probably at least a master's degree, right? So you probably at least need some sort of master's degree in probably counseling. There may be some psychology programs, master's programs that would allow you to start counseling, but probably if you're going to get a master's degree and want to be a counselor, it's probably going to be in counseling. We have a pretty good counseling program here. It meets right around that hallway somewhere. It's right here somewhere. We have a pretty good counseling program here. What are some other ways that you could be a counselor or some type of clinical psychologist? What other things could you need? A clinical degree, what's that? Okay, so a PhD perhaps in clinical psychology, or my degree is in counseling psychology. So you can get a PhD. Has anybody ever heard of a PsyD? P-S-Y-D? PsyD. This is a newer degree, and a lot of folks haven't heard of it. It's not really new. I mean, it's probably 20, 30 years old at this point, but you know, the PhD is ancient. So it's a newer degree, but it's a little bit more focused on the clinical aspect, which generally assumed if you get a PhD in any subject, PhD really means Doctor of Philosophy in Latin. This, of course, is Doctor of Psychology. And so when you get a PhD, you're expected to just know a lot about the topic in terms of being able to write about it, in terms of being able to do research about it, in terms of being able to teach it, right? A PhD sort of has this person is a broad, very broad understanding of some specific topics, including being able to apply them or teach or study. Whereas the PsyD is really more specific to the applied piece. You might see them doing some teaching, that's a bit applied, right? It's certainly in psychology. But usually what you'll see a PsyD do is be a doctor of psychology, just be a psychologist. Only a doctor, only a PhD, or a PsyD can call themselves a psychologist. Like legally. So only a PhD or a PsyD can call themselves a psychologist. Folks with this degree often will go with counselor or therapist, and so there's a bit of that difference. There's a couple other ways to apply psychology. What else? What are some other ways that you, or maybe folks that you've known, have interacted with psychology? Did you go see a psychologist, or did you see a, what's the other word? People get confused.
Psychiatrist?
Or a psychiatrist, is that what you're gonna say?
Maybe I was gonna say therapist, but that could be different.
Yeah, so a therapist is probably, I sometimes call myself a therapist, but you know, at least a master's degree for that. But what I was looking for was the psychiatrist. What's the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist? Yes, sir.
They go to med school and they can prescribe.
This guy knows all the answers. You taken this class before? He's really like psychology. Just really smart. He didn't want to say. All right, well, so you're right. A psychiatrist has an MD. That is to say, they've gone to medical school. Not to graduate school, which is what I went to, which is what PhDs go to. They went to medical school in particular. What does that mean? Well, now I'm biased, of course, I'm a psychologist, but I would say that a psychologist has a bit more understanding of psychology than a psychiatrist does, and here's why. If you want to be a psychiatrist, what you do is you go to med school for 3 years, which is the normal course of med school, maybe 4. You go to med school for those years, and then you go into your residency. And your residency is when you kind of go practice being a doctor, right? They let you off the reins a little bit. You work in the hospital. If you've ever seen Scrubs, the beginning of that show, those guys are residents, right? They're working under a doctor who's more senior to them, but they are still doing doctor stuff. If you want to be a psychiatrist, you go through medical school, and when you get to residency, you choose a rotation in psychiatry. So you get a broad medical education, but then when you start specializing in terms of your practice, then you begin to specialize in that psychiatric care. Good. I would say that that's different than us who spend our whole graduate career learning about psychology, right? The first class that we take when we get to graduate school is here's how you help people via psychology. So it's going to be different, of course. I'm learning mostly talk therapy. I'm learning group therapy. I'm learning assessments, these type of things. Whereas they're going to be learning some of that stuff when they get into rotation, but primarily how a psychiatrist is going to treat you is via medication. Now they can do therapy, and some of them do that, but if I'm being honest, what they generally figure out is that I can spend 15 minutes with 4 clients and charge them $200 a pop, or I can spend an hour with 1 client and charge them $200 a pop. So they usually just go with this model of tell me your symptoms, okay, depressed, this. Not to say they're not taking their time and doing good work, but they're just gonna get your diagnosis and they're gonna say, here, this might help you, next, right? Versus coming in and seeing you weekly for a whole hour, right? It just doesn't make as much sense. So that's kind of the difference in how you probably expect to be treated just between the two professions. Of course, psychologists can't prescribe, so if you need medication, and to be truthful, right, some diagnoses really do just need medication. Therapy is always helpful, but if you need medication, you're gonna need to see a psychiatrist. Any questions about this stuff? Yes, ma'am.
So could you not just be a psychologist, be like a psychiatrist and spend like an hour with like a client?
You could.
And then prescribe them also?
Yeah, you could.
Okay.
And some do. It's again, it's a little rarer just because of the money, honestly. But they can do that. They usually just choose to kind of see more people in that amount of time. Yeah, good question. Some other ways that you might apply, we won't kind of belabor it too much, is what we call, oh gosh, it's also often called just IO psychology. It stands for industrial, spell that, industrial organizational psychology. That's definitely wrong, but figure it out. Industrial organizational psychology is just the type of psychology where I'm going to go into a business and I'm going to say, it looks like these groups aren't working well together. It looks like the lines of communication between employees and management is not very good. This is really slowing down production because your group doesn't have a lot of morale. Here are some things that you could build into your organization in order to make things run more efficiently, in order to make people more happy so they're better at their jobs when they come to work, right? And so this industrial organizational psychologist, or the IO psychologist, as they're sometimes called, actually does a bit of the clinical work combined with social psychology, right? That sense of how the situation affects the individual gets folded into thinking about how the work situation or school or classroom situation is affecting the individual. Again, we still consider that some type of applied psychology, because you're going out and you're putting the work in. Okay, that's all I got. All right, so look for on Thursday sometime after Thursday, I guess, you will get your lecture on personality. We'll get started with that. I'll probably be still talking about that on Tuesday next when you guys get here. Otherwise, that's about it. Send me questions if you have them. I will check my email. Have a good week.